Eleanor Fairfax stood at the foot of the long table at Milestone Park, both hands flat upon the white cloth, and did not move. She did not flush. She did not reach for her glass. She did not look toward the door as though escape were a thing still available to her. She set her right hand over her left, the way her father had taught her to still herself over a column of figures that would not yet balance, and she waited for the Duke of Milestone to finish speaking to a room of 40 guests, who had, until that moment, been eating his wedding breakfast in polite ignorance of what he thought of his bride. "See that her allowance is settled the way you would settle any tradesman's bill, Crane," Gideon Ashford said, not to her, but past her, to the steward standing at his elbow with a ledger already open. Promptly, and without argument, this marriage is only business, and business is best conducted plainly. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the particular silence of a room deciding whether to laugh. Eleanor reached up with 2 fingers and touched the ribbon at her throat, where a small iron key hung against her collarbone, cool even through the linen. She did not take it off. She untucked it, slow and unhurried, and let it rest in plain sight upon her bodice instead of hidden beneath. The single decisive motion of a woman moving a thing from a private ledger into a public one. "Then I keep my own money," she said, and her voice did not rise to meet the room's attention. It simply arrived there, level as a table. By the following autumn the county would tell that sentence to each other the way they told weather, as something that had simply happened, unimprovable by retelling, and the Duke of Milestone would spend the year between learning, slowly and at some cost to his pride, exactly what business could not buy. The spring of 1819 had come to Ashcombe the way it always did, indifferent to the particular arithmetic of any one family's ruin or repair. It found Milestone Park with its roof sound and its fields sour, a house maintained on credit and reputation long after both had thinned to something like rumour. It found Gideon Ashford, 7th Duke of Milestone, 31 years old, and colder than the house he had inherited, negotiating through solicitors for a bride whose father's mills had made more money in 11 years than the Ashford lands had made in 11 decades. Josiah Fairfax had been a wool merchant of Renfield, a market town 12 miles east, and he had died the previous winter, leaving his only child a fortune assembled entirely by his own hand, and a piece of advice she repeated to herself the way other women repeated prayers: "Keep your own accounts." A woman who cannot show her sums has already given away the argument. The marriage had been arranged in 6 weeks by men who called it a sensible alliance, which was another way of saying it solved 2 problems that had nothing to do with each other: his need for capital, her need for a name that would let a merchant's daughter sit unremarked in any drawing-room in the county. Nobody had asked whether the 2 people involved might also solve something in each other. Eleanor had not expected them to ask. She had gone into the arrangement with her eyes open and her ledger packed, and in the 3 weeks of courtship required by propriety she had already, without anyone remarking on it, settled a dispute between 2 of his tenant farmers over a shared well, corrected an error in his bailiff's spring accounts, and answered 11 letters he had let sit unanswered on his study desk for a month. None of it had been noticed as work. It had been noticed, if at all, as convenience, the useful quiet of a woman who did not require entertaining. She had understood, watching him not notice, that she was being catalogued rather than known. She had told herself this was sufficient. A business arrangement required no more than that. She had believed it, more or less, until the wedding breakfast, when the arrangement was named aloud, over a table of 40 guests, in a sentence that turned 11 weeks of quiet competence into a single word: useful, not loved. Filed, weighed, and entered on the correct side of a page. She had known, watching Gideon Ashford's face as he said it, composed, unbothered, already turning back to his steward, that he believed himself to be speaking a kindness. Plain dealing, he would have called it. No false promises exchanged. He thought he was sparing her the indignity of hoping for more than the arrangement offered. He did not yet understand that a woman who had built a fortune out of wool and arithmetic did not require his permission to hope, and did not require his estimation of her worth to know it. He would learn this the way he learned most things that mattered, slowly, at cost, and in the end, because the numbers made it impossible for him to keep believing otherwise. The key at her throat caught the light from the tall windows as she stood there. 40 faces turned toward her, waiting to see whether the merchant's daughter would weep. She did not weep. She had work to do. The room did not empty all at once. Weddings never do. There is always a slow tide of guests finding their carriages, their gloves, their excuses, and Eleanor stood through the whole of it with her spine straight and her hands folded, accepting congratulations that had curdled, in the space of one sentence, into something closer to condolence. Lady Otterline, the Duke's aunt, pressed her fingers and murmured that Gideon had always had a very practical way of speaking, as though practicality were a coat that could be handed to a bride for warmth. Mr. Aldous Crane, the steward, bowed over her hand with a smile so smooth it seemed poured rather than worn, and said he looked forward to a most efficient arrangement of the household accounts, Your Grace, now that we may consolidate. We may not, Eleanor said, and smiled back at him with exactly the same warmth he had offered her, which was to say none at all wasted, and precisely enough to be unimpeachable. Crane's smile did not move. Something behind it did, very slightly, the way a curtain moves when a window has been opened somewhere else in the house. When the last carriage had gone, she permitted herself the garden. She had learned this discipline from her father in the year her mother died. 10 minutes, no more. Walked out under whatever sky was available. And then the ledger again. She counted them now against the small enamel watch pinned to her bodice, standing among milestones overgrown roses, and did not spend a single one of the 10 minutes on tears. She spent them on inventory instead, the way she had been taught. What is mine? My father's ledgers, 3 trunks of them, arriving tomorrow by cart. My own account at the Renfield Bank, in my name established the week before the wedding on my father's specific instruction. My name, which is now a duchess's name, and remains, underneath that, a merchant's daughter's name, and has never yet been proven wrong about a sum. At the 10th minute she stopped, the way she always stopped, and went back inside to find where they had put her trunks. She found, instead, Ezra Fenwick standing in the West Hall with his hat in both hands, and an expression of profound disapproval aimed at the ceiling, as though the house itself had personally offended him. He had been her father's clerk for 19 years, was 61 years old, built like a fence post, and had followed her from Renfield with the single stated purpose of seeing the accounts kept honest. Which is more than I can say for the look of this hallway. They put your father's ledgers in the box room, he said, without preamble. Next to the fishing rods. I have already had them moved. Thank you, Ezra, I heard what he said. Fenwick's jaw worked once. Business, yes, your father built a fortune on the theory that a man who says a thing plainly, in front of witnesses, has usually decided in advance he can afford to be held to it. Fenwick set his hat down at last, on the hall table, with the particular finality of a man laying down a tool he intends to pick up again shortly. I should think you might hold him to it. I intend to, Eleanor said. Starting with the money. Fenwick almost smiled. It did not fully arrive, but something in the deep creases around his eyes eased by a fraction. The first small sign that the house had acquired, in one afternoon, a second ally against whatever it turned out to require defending against. The letter came the next morning, before she had finished her tea. Crane's hand, small and even as a copyist's, Your Grace. In the interest of efficiency, I have prepared papers consolidating the Fairfax trade accounts under the general estate management, pending your signature. I remain your most obedient servant. Eleanor read it twice, folded it along its original crease, and set it beneath the inkwell rather than answer it at once. There would be an answer. It would not be the one Crane was expecting, and it would not be given in a letter. The estate's difficulty, when it came, arrived the ordinary way, in the mouth of a man too honest to disguise bad news as anything else. Torrance, the bailiff, found her in the estate office on her fourth morning at Marston. Sleeves turned back. 3 of her father's ledgers open across a desk that had clearly not held open ledgers in some time. The Hallows End flock is short, Torrance said. He was a broad grey man who had managed the Marston sheep for 30 years, and looked, at that moment, like a man delivering news to the wrong person on purpose, in the hope she would send him to someone else. 90 head unaccounted between the spring count and now. Mr. Crane says foot rot, and losses to the low fields flooding. I don't say he's wrong. I say I've kept this flock 30 years and never lost 90 head to rot in one season without smelling it on the wind first. Show me the spring count, Eleanor said, and the fleece sale figures from the wool merchant at Renfield, and the feed purchases for the low fields since March. Torrance blinked. Your Grace, the household accounts are Mr. Crane's, the flock is the estate's income. Mr. Torrance, and the estate's income is now partly secured by my father's mills, which makes it partly my concern, as well as the Duke's. Bring me the figures. I will have an answer for you by Thursday. He brought them, with the particular reluctance of a man convinced he was wasting a fine lady's time, and by Thursday she had laid 3 columns side by side on the desk, the spring count, the feed purchases and the fleece weights sold at Renfield Market, where her father's old contacts still traded, and still, out of respect for Josiah Fairfax's memory, answered a straightforward letter with straightforward figures. There is no rot, she said, when Torrance returned. A flock lost to rot loses weight before it loses head. The surviving fleece thins, the sale price drops. Your fleece weights are steady. What you have lost is not sheep. What you have lost is 90 heads worth of feed, purchased and paid for, and never delivered to a flock that never shrank in the first place. Torrance stared at the columns for a long moment. Someone's selling the feed twice, then, once on paper, once for coin. That would be my reading as well, Eleanor said. I would like the feed merchant's actual delivery receipts, not the estate copies. I expect they will not match. They did not match, and Torrance, 3 days later, stood in the estate office with his hat in his hands exactly as Fenwick had stood in the hallway, and said, with the air of a man surrendering a long-held position, I'll bring my figures to you first from now on, Your Grace, if it's all the same. It was the first conversion, and it was not the last. Word of the flock travelled the way such things always travelled on an estate, through kitchens and stable-yards faster than through drawing-rooms, and within a fortnight 3 more of Mileston's people had found small, ordinary reasons to bring Eleanor a column of figures before they brought it to anyone else. Gideon noticed the flock resolved before he noticed how. He noticed first that Torrance had stopped looking harried. He noticed, some days later, standing in the passage outside the estate office with a letter in his hand, that his wife was visible through the half-open door bent over 3 ledgers with a pencil behind her ear, entirely unaware of him, entirely absorbed, and that the sight of her like that produced in him a small, unfamiliar disturbance he did not examine closely enough to name. He did not go in. He told himself he had a letter to answer, and went to answer it, and did not think of the ledgers again until that evening at dinner, when Torrance mentioned the flock's recovery to Crane in a tone of open respect that made Crane smile, for just a moment, go very still. A clerical confusion, Crane said, regrettably common in an estate of this size. I am gratified it is resolved. It was not clerical, Eleanor said, pleasantly, buttering bread. It was arithmetic. There is a difference. Crane's fork did not pause. His eyes did, very briefly, before he smiled again, and asked her whether she found the Milestone kitchens equal to her Renfield ones. Gideon, watching this exchange over his wine, said nothing, but he found himself, later that week, standing in the same doorway again. This time, long enough that she looked up and caught him at it. And he did not, as he might have a month earlier, offer some remark about business to cover the moment. He simply nodded, once, and went on his way, and Eleanor sat afterward with her pencil idle for a full minute, turning that small, wordless acknowledgment over the way she might have turned an unfamiliar coin. It was not warmth. It was, perhaps, the very beginning of the possibility of it, the first rung, unremarked and easily missed, on a ladder neither of them had yet admitted they were climbing. The second trial came with the harvest, and it came harder. A boundary dispute had simmered for 2 years between Milestone and the neighbouring Deacon's estate over a stretch of low meadow whose drainage ditches had silted and shifted the actual line of the land, so that neither side's old maps agreed with the water now standing in the fields. Deakins' man had threatened suit. Crane had recommended settling by concession, cede the meadow, avoid the cost of a survey, and Gideon, distracted and disinclined to spend money on lawyers, had been on the point of agreeing. "May I see the old surveys?" Eleanor asked at dinner, before anything is signed. "It is an estate matter," Gideon said, not unkindly, but with the particular flatness of a man reciting a rule rather than making a decision. "There is no need to trouble you with it. It borders the low fields where the feed was purchased twice," Eleanor said. "I have already troubled myself with it." He looked at her for a moment, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he does not enjoy, and then, without further argument, sent for the surveys. She spent 4 days with them, and with the parish tithe maps from 30 years before, and with an old tenant named Whitlow, who remembered, as a boy, exactly where his father had dug the original ditches, and was delighted to be asked. What emerged was not a concession, but a correction. Deakins' own drainage works, cut a decade earlier, had diverted water onto Milestone land and silted the boundary ditch in Milestone's favour, not against it. The meadow, properly surveyed, belonged where it had always belonged. It was Deakins who owed compensation for 2 years of flooded acreage, not Milestone who owed the meadow. She laid this out for Gideon in the estate office, with the old maps spread between them, and watched him read her columns twice before he looked up. "You are certain?" "I am certain enough to stand in front of a magistrate and say so, which is a different thing from being merely willing to say so at dinner." Something crossed his face that was almost, Not quite. Admiration. Crane advised concession. Crane did not look at the old ditches. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he said, my father would have taken Crane's advice without reading the surveys at all. He preferred not to look closely at anything that might cost him an uncomfortable conversation. It was the first thing he had told her about his father that was not a matter of public record, and she recognised it, correctly, as a door left very slightly ajar. What happened to him? She asked, gently, and did not press further than the question itself. Gideon did not answer that night. He answered 3 weeks later, at his aunt's dinner table, not to Eleanor directly, but to Lady Otterline. In a low voice Eleanor was not meant to hear and heard anyway, seated 2 chairs down. His father, the 6th Duke, had trusted a friend of 30 years' standing, a man named Rain, with the whole of the estate's liquid capital, invested in a canal scheme Rain swore would triple it within 5 years. Rain had wanted the money, in the end, not for the canal but for a woman he meant to marry against his own family's wishes, and had gambled the Ashford capital on a venture he privately knew was already failing, gambling that he could recoup it before anyone noticed. He could not. The estate had gone from comfortable to encumbered in 18 months, and Gideon's mother, who had married for exactly the kind of sentiment her husband's friend had just proven ruinous, had left within the year, not abandoning her son so much as abandoning a house she said she could no longer bear to watch drown. My father used to say love was the most expensive thing a man could put his name to, Gideon told his aunt, and I believed him, because I watched it cost him everything he had. Eleanor set down her fork very quietly, and did not let her face show that she had heard. She understood him better, after that, though she did not yet forgive him the wedding breakfast. Understanding a wound does not obligate a woman to excuse what a man has done while nursing it. But she understood now that his coldness was not verdict but armour, badly fitted and never once examined, and that a man wearing armour could sometimes be argued out of it if the argument were patient enough and the proof solid enough. Crane, meanwhile, had begun a quieter campaign. Rumours reached the county, nothing so crude as an accusation, only a raised eyebrow here, a remark there, always delivered by someone else, always traceable back, if one troubled to trace it, to a conversation with the Duke's steward. It was said that Josiah Fairfax's fortune had not been quite so honestly assembled as the county believed. It was said a former partner of his had come to grief. It was said, softly, that a woman who kept her own accounts so very carefully must have something in them worth hiding. Lady Otterline repeated one such remark to Eleanor over tea, watching her closely for a reaction. How industrious of Mr. Crane, Eleanor said, to have found the time to invent it. You do not deny it. I do not answer rumours with denials, Lady Otterline. I answer them with figures, when someone is prepared to be specific enough to name one. She smiled, and meant the sub-channel of it precisely. I am not frightened, and you should tell him so. Lady Otterline, to her credit, looked faintly uncomfortable, and did not repeat the remark again that season. But the seed was planted, and Eleanor understood, walking back from that tea, with her hands folded and her pace unhurried, that Crane had moved from 90 head of feed to something considerably larger, and that the low fields had only ever been a rehearsal. The locked room at Marlstone was on the north side of the house, above the old estate office, and Eleanor had noticed the door in her first week and asked no one about it, filing the question away the way she filed most things, not forgotten, only waiting for its moment. Gideon brought her there himself, 6 weeks into the marriage, on an evening when the household had gone to bed, and the house had that particular held breath quiet of a place still deciding whether it trusted the people inside it. He carried the key himself, unused to it, the lock stiff with disuse. Inside was his father's old study, kept exactly as it had been left the year the canal scheme collapsed, a desk with an unfinished letter still upon it, a shelf of ledgers no one had opened in a decade, a portrait of a woman Eleanor recognised, from the shape of Gideon's jaw, as his mother. "I have not been in here since I was 19, Gideon said. I told myself it was grief. I think now it was closer to superstition. If I did not look at what he had lost, I did not have to calculate how badly. May I look? I brought you here to ask you to." She spent an hour with the ledgers while he stood at the window with his hands behind his back, watching the dark garden rather than watching her, which she understood as its own kind of trust, a man allowing a woman to see the worst arithmetic of his family without supervising her reaction to it. When she finally closed the last ledger, she said, "Your father was not ruined by love, Gideon. He was ruined by a friend who used the appearance of love to disguise a very ordinary fraud. Those are not the same failure, and you have spent your whole adult life punishing the wrong one." He turned from the window. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence held the particular weight of a man rearranging a belief he had built his whole character upon. "I have handled you the same way," he said finally, "as though your worth were a sum I might be swindled on if I let myself value it at more than I could verify." "Yes," Eleanor said, "you have. I am sorry for it." "Sorry is not the same as changed," she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "Show me." "Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, the way I would ask any man to prove a column of figures, not by swearing to the total, but by letting me watch him add it." He nodded slowly. "What would that look like? To you?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously. "Ask before you decide something that touches my money or my name." "Not for permission, I do not require your permission, but because a partnership consults, and this has not yet been won." He was quiet a moment. Then, without ceremony, he crossed to the old desk, opened the bottom drawer, and drew out a second key, small and unused, that had clearly been cut and set aside years before for a lock that no longer needed it. "I had a copy made of the strongbox key," he said, "the week after the wedding breakfast. I meant it as an assertion of authority. I did not send it to Crane to have it fitted, in the end. I could not decide what I meant by keeping it, so I kept it, and did nothing with it, which I am told is its own kind of cowardice." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "What do you mean by it now?" "I would like you to keep both keys," he said, "mine and yours. Not consolidated, I understand now what that word cost you. Kept together, if you are willing, because I would like to be the kind of man whose key you are willing to hold." She took the second key from his open palm, turned it once between her fingers, and did not that night put it on the ribbon beside the first. She kept it separate, in her own pocket, a small unfinished thing, proof accepted, but not yet proof paid in full. The discrepancy that broke the case open was smaller, at first, than the missing sheep, a single figure, in Fenwick's meticulous hand, that would not reconcile no matter how many times he added it. £412, Fenwick said, laying 2 ledgers side by side on the estate office desk, drawn from your Renfield account, your Grace, against your signature, for the purchase of drainage tile for the low fields. Except the low fields were drained in April, before this withdrawal was made, and the tile merchant in Renfield has no record of the sale at all. Eleanor studied the signature. It was hers, her hand, her particular loop on the F, her flourish beneath, reproduced with a competence that would have satisfied anyone who had not spent a lifetime signing her own name. "I did not sign this," she said. "I did not think you had," Fenwick said grimly. "I have known your signature since you were 9 years old, copying it out of your father's ledger for practice. This is close. It is not you. The pressure is wrong at the crossbar. You lift the pen there. Whoever made this did not." They went to Renfield together, she and Fenwick, and, at her insistence, Gideon, and spoke with the bank's clerk, a careful young man named Pruitt, who went pale when shown the withdrawal slip, and admitted, after some pressing, that Mr. Crane had presented it personally, along with what he had understood to be the Duke's standing authorization to act for the estate's combined accounts. "There is no standing authorization," Gideon said. "I signed nothing of the kind." Pruitt produced the authorization letter Crane had filed. Gideon's signature sat at the bottom of it, correct in every particular, and utterly unfamiliar to the man who was supposed to have written it. "I did not sign this either," Gideon said, very quietly, and Eleanor watched something settle in him, not surprise. Exactly, but the particular grim satisfaction of a man discovering that his instinct to distrust had for once been pointed in the wrong direction. They took the 2 forged papers to Mr. Barnaby Loach, a solicitor in Renfield who had handled Josiah Fairfax's affairs for 15 years, and had the dry, procedural manner of a man who had never once in his career been swayed by a title. He examined both signatures under a glass for the better part of an hour, comparing them against a dozen genuine specimens Fenwick had brought, and delivered his verdict without adornment. Forged, both of them. Competent work, but not expert, the forger favoured his own natural slant under pressure, here and here. "I would stake my licence on it in front of any magistrate in the county." The withdrawal was not isolated. Loach and Fenwick, working through the estate accounts across a week of long evenings, found a pattern reaching back nearly 3 years, small sums, always plausible, always covered by some invented purchase or repair, always drawn against authorizations that grew bolder as no one questioned the earlier ones. The total, when Fenwick finally added the column and set down his pen, came to just under £3,000. Crane's counterstroke came 4 days later, delivered not to Eleanor, but circulated first through the county, the way poison is always easiest to administer in a drink someone else pours. A sworn statement, notarized by a magistrate 2 counties distant, whom no one in Ashcombe had ever heard of, alleging that Josiah Fairfax had defrauded a former trading partner of a substantial sum some 15 years before, and that his daughter's fortune, and by extension her husband's restored solvency, rested on money that was never honestly his to leave her. It reached Eleanor at breakfast, delivered by Lady Otterline, with an expression that was trying, not entirely successfully, to look sympathetic rather than curious. Eleanor read it twice. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend her father aloud to the table. She folded the letter along its crease, set it beside her plate, and said, "I know this signature. It belongs to a magistrate my father once fined for accepting a bribe from a fleece merchant in Leeds. Mr. Crane has chosen his forgeries from a man he assumed no one in Ashcombe would trouble to write to. I will trouble to write to him this morning." She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She finished her tea, and then she went to find Fenwick, because there was work to do, and the counted minutes she permitted herself for the sting of it had, by the time she reached the study door, already run out. The Michaelmas gathering at Marston had always been the largest of the year. Tenants, tradesmen, and half the county assembled in the long barn for the settling of quarter accounts, a tradition Josiah Fairfax would have recognised instantly as the merchant's instinct dressed in a duke's clothing. Everyone present, everyone owed an honest reckoning. Nothing decided behind a closed door that could as easily be decided in the light. Eleanor had asked for it to proceed as usual. Crane, unaware of quite how much ground had shifted beneath him, had agreed readily, perhaps believing that a public gathering, conducted on his own familiar ground, would be the safest place to let the forgery accusation quietly die of its own weight. She stood before the assembled hall with her father's ledgers on the table beside her, Fenwick at her right hand and Loach at her left, and Gideon standing not behind her, as he might once have stood, but beside her, which the room noted before a single word had been spoken. "There has been a claim circulated," she said, and her voice carried to the back of the barn without rising, "that my father's fortune was dishonestly made. I will not answer that claim with denial. I will answer it with the magistrate whose signature was forged to make it." The magistrate, summoned by a fast rider 4 days earlier, and, as it happened, still nursing a decade-old grudge against the fleece merchant who had once tried to bribe him, stood and confirmed in a dry, unhurried voice that he had never signed such a statement, had never heard of Josiah Fairfax's alleged partner, and would be glad to say so before any bench in the kingdom. The room's attention, which had arrived amused and sceptical, began, audibly, to turn. "There has also been a discrepancy in the estate accounts," Eleanor went on, "amounting to some £3,000, drawn against forged authorisations bearing my signature and my husband's. Mr. Loach has examined both. I will let him speak to his findings." Loach spoke for 4 unadorned minutes, comparing signatures held up for the room to see, and Crane, standing near the barn door with his smooth smile fixed and slightly too wide, said, when appealed to directly, that the discrepancies were regrettable clerical confusions, the sort of thing that happened in any large estate, and that he was frankly astonished her Grace would stage so public a spectacle over what amounted to bookkeeping. "Then, perhaps," Eleanor said, "the tile merchant can settle the confusion for us. I believe he is here. He was. Tam Whitlow's father, the drainage tile merchant from the far end of the parish, had come to the gathering as he came every year to settle his own small account, entirely unaware he was about to be the hinge of anyone else's. Asked plainly whether he had sold £412 of drainage tile to Marston in April, he said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had never once in his life found it necessary to lie, that he had sold no such thing, that his entire business that spring had come to under £60, and that he would be glad to show his own books to prove it. 3 more tenants, unbidden and unrehearsed, came forward in the next quarter hour with small, ordinary corrections to the estate's account of itself, a bill paid twice, a repair invented, a sale that had never happened, each one a splinter, none decisive alone, together an unmistakable pattern that the room read correctly before Crane found any further use for his smile. Something behind his composure went out, all at once, the way a lamp goes out when the wick finally runs dry, rather than when the wind takes it. He said nothing further in his own defence. There was by then nothing further to say that the room would have believed. Eleanor could have had him bound over for the magistrate that same evening. She had the proof for it, and half the county would have supported her without a murmur. "Mr. Crane will resign his position tonight," she said instead, and leave Ashcombe within the week. His pension is forfeited. His name will not be spoken at Milestone again, by anyone in my employ, in any context whatsoever. I extend him this rather than a bench and a public record, not because he has earned mercy, but because I find I would rather spend the next 20 years running this estate than spend them discussing him. It was mercy dispensed from a position that made mercy meaningful, and the room understood the difference, and the tide of it, the audible, unmistakable turning of 40 families' opinion, settled that night, finally and completely in her favour. The explanation Gideon owed her did not come that night, in the flush of the gathering, when anything said might have been mistaken for gratitude rather than truth. It came 3 evenings later, in the estate office, with the ledgers put away, and the house gone quiet around them. An apology is not the same as an explanation, Eleanor said, when he began, haltingly with "I am sorry." "I have had the apology already, in the barn, when you stood beside me instead of behind Crane's excuses. I would like the explanation now. All of it." He gave it to her without flinching, his father's ruin laid bare in full, the friend who had traded on love to disguise a fraud, his mother's departure, the decision, made at 19, and never once revisited. That sentiment was the doorway through which every family catastrophe he had ever witnessed had entered. He told her he had married her, believing he was protecting them both by refusing to open that door, and had understood, watching her stand in the barn with the county's opinion turning like a tide behind her, that he had confused a locked door with a strong one, and that they were not the same thing at all. "I know the difference now," he said. "I would like the chance to prove I know it, on whatever terms you set." "Then hear my terms," Eleanor said, and counted them off the way she counted a column, plainly one at a time. "My accounts remain mine, absolutely, in my name, forever, not as a concession. As a fact you will simply live beside. My name goes on the estate ledgers alongside yours, not beneath them. Every tenant and every hand on this estate is paid a fair wage, set and reviewed openly, starting with the next quarter day, and Crane's name, as I said, is never spoken here again. That is not negotiable, and I will not mediate it if it is raised." "All right," Gideon said. "All right, then," Eleanor said, and something in the set of her shoulders eased for the first time since the wedding breakfast. It was not the whole treaty. It was, however, the whole of what mattered. Lady Otterline came to her 2 days later, without being sent for, and stood in the doorway of the estate office with an expression Eleanor had not yet seen on her. Something considerably less composed than her usual social armour. "I told you his manner of speaking was merely practical," Lady Otterline said. "I told others the same, in this county, more than once, and I told it to you as though it were a comfort. I have thought better of it since the barn. I am sorry for the part I played in making you feel weighed rather than welcomed. It was thoughtlessly done, and I have had a great deal of time this week to be ashamed of how easily it was done." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it, because an apology offered without being asked for was worth considerably more than one extracted. "I accept it." "All right, then," Lady Otterline said, faintly startled to find the exchange already complete, and left considerably lighter than she had arrived. Proof, when it finally came, arrived the way Eleanor had asked for it, not in speeches, but in ordinary days, stacked one on another until their accumulation became its own kind of argument. It arrived in the chair Gideon began, without remark, to move from across the estate office to beside her, close enough that 2 people could read the same ledger at once. It arrived in tea poured and set at her elbow before she had asked for it, because he had learned, finally, what hour she preferred it. It arrived in the wage board he had a joiner build and hang in the estate office. The tenant rates posted openly for anyone to check against the ledger. His own idea. Offered to her not as a gift requiring gratitude, but as a fact for her approval. None of it, alone, would have meant anything. Together, week upon week, it meant a great deal. The relapse came in November, small and almost forgivable, which was precisely why it mattered. A tenant's roof needed mending before the frost, and Gideon, out riding the boundary with Torrance, made the decision on the spot and instructed the repair without a word to her, not from any wish to exclude her, but from the old, unexamined habit of a man who had spent 30 years deciding a state, matters alone before he had ever had a reason not to. She heard of it that evening, from Torrance rather than from him, and said nothing accusing when Gideon came in. She only said quietly, "You decided the Hollis roof without me." He stopped. Started again. "I did. I did not think of it as a decision that touched you. It was a roof, not a ledger." "It touched the wage board," she said. "It touched the estate's money, which touches the terms we agreed. I am not angry that the roof was mended. I am naming the pattern so that it does not become a habit you stop noticing." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him do the harder thing than apologize. She watched him actually examine the habit rather than merely regret its result. "You are right," he said finally. "It was not thoughtlessness once. It has been thoughtlessness 11 times since Michaelmas, and I have simply not been made to count them until now. I will not make it 12. He did not. The count held, through the winter and past it, and Eleanor marked the holding the way she marked any figure that had finally come to balance, with quiet satisfaction and no further comment necessary. It was in February, with snow on the low fields and the estate accounts finally, entirely, unimpeachably his and hers together, that he said the thing she had been waiting to hear, though she had never once asked for it. "I would choose you," Gideon said, not as declaration made for effect, but the way a man states a total he has checked 3 times and trusts. "I have been choosing you for some time now, since the barn, if I am honest, though I did not have the courage to say so until I had proven it in the ordinary days first, as you asked. I mean to keep on choosing you for as long as you will let the sum stand." "It stands," Eleanor said, and did not say the 3 bare words either, because they had never needed them. They had built something sturdier than a phrase, and both of them knew it. 2 years brought their own ordinary arithmetic to milestone, the way 2 years generally do. Ezra Fenwick became the estate's permanent accountant in all but name, a title he refused on the grounds that titles were for people who needed reminding of their worth, and trained a young clerk of his own who kept a signature nearly as steady as Eleanor's. Torrance's flock had not lost a single head to anything but honest weather in 2 full years, and he told anyone who would listen that he had never worked for a keener set of eyes than the Duchess's. Tam Whitlow's father was given the standing contract for all the estate's tile and timber, his honesty at the Michaelmas gathering never forgotten by a single tenant who had stood in that barn. Of Aldous Crane, the county heard only once more, a brief and unremarkable notice that a man of that name had taken a minor clerking position in a distant shire, and was not, by all accounts, prospering. The wage board Gideon had built still hung in the estate office, its figures reviewed openly each quarter, copied now by 2 neighbouring estates, whose landlords had grown tired of explaining to their own tenants why Milestone's rates ran fairer than theirs. Beside it, funded jointly from the estate's restored income, and a portion of Eleanor's own trade money. A small schoolhouse had opened at the edge of Wrenfield the previous spring, named, at Fenwick's quiet insistence, and over Eleanor's mild protest, the Fairfax School, the first in the county to teach a working child's daughter her letters and her sums with equal seriousness. The key no longer hung hidden beneath any collar. Eleanor wore it openly now, on a chain long enough to sit visible above her bodice, and beside it, on the same chain, hung the second key Gideon had once cut in cold assertion, and later given in something closer to trust. 2 keys to one box, worn together in the light, the plainest inversion either of them could have chosen, and neither had needed to discuss it to arrive at it. "This marriage is only business," he had said once, in front of 40 guests, believing it a kindness. This marriage was never business, he told her now, in an empty estate office with the wage board between them, and the fire burned low, and I think some part of me suspected that from the first morning I found myself standing at your door for no better reason than to watch you work. It was the only true account I have ever kept, and it is the one I intend to keep the longest. Marston Park that winter no longer held its breath the way it once had. The house had a particular quality now. Visitors remarked on it, without quite being able to name it, some warmth in the wood or the light that had not been there in the old Duke's time, or in the first cold months of the new one. It was, quite simply, a house that had stopped waiting to be disappointed, and had begun, instead, to be lived in. She had not asked to be seen, not at the breakfast table with 40 guests watching, not in the estate office with a pencil behind her ear, not once in 2 years of ledgers and boundary disputes and quiet accumulating proof. She had simply gone on doing the work in front of her, plainly, competently, without performance, until seeing her stopped being a choice anyone around her had the option to make differently. She had made herself impossible to file away as merely useful, not because she had demanded it, and not because anyone had finally granted it to her, but because a woman who keeps her own accounts, faithfully, year upon year, eventually owns the whole of the argument, and no one, not a duke, not a county, not even the woman herself in her most doubting hour, can afterward take that away.